The panel that we have, very distinguished people on the panel, is here to discuss a very promising initiative that promotes regional cooperation in the Middle East, something that I think we can all agree is very much needed. MEI's Program for Conflict Resolution Track 2 Dialogue is headed by Dr. Rhonda Slim. Her program provides opportunities for face-to-face dialogue for current and former officials and other senior experts from countries that are both allies and adversaries throughout the Middle East, but it also includes the EU, UN, Russia, and China. The Track 2 dialogue that we will be discussing today is the Middle East Dialogue. We call it the Middle East Dialogue, and that's been operating since 2012. From the outset, this dialogue has pursued two parallel tracks. First, it was to develop ideas and proposals to promote the de-escalation of the conflict in Syria and Iraq. But second was to explore more positive, more forward-looking, to explore principles and an institutional framework for a new regional architecture in the Middle East. Sometimes we all get wrapped up in conflict that we don't think beyond that, think more optimistically beyond conflict. And that's what this dialogue has done. The most recent meeting was held in Baghdad with the cooperation of the Office of the Iraqi Prime Minister. The participants there worked out a joint declaration, which we have called the Baghdad Declaration. Now, the Baghdad Declaration outlines principles for good neighbor policies and relations throughout the Middle East. The document, which I think is available at the front, I hope you picked up a copy of it. This is actually the launch for the Baghdad Declaration. It took some time to work out. This wasn't easy. This was worked out over a number of different sessions over the last several years. It's gone through many drafts, but finally in Baghdad, under the sponsorship and cooperation of the Baghdad government, all participants were able to sign the principles. So today we have 4 participants who've been working on the Baghdad Declaration all along, and they will discuss regional cooperation and how these principles outlined in the Baghdad Declaration can constitute a step forward on the path of more regional cooperation. We're honored today, truly honored today, to have Dr. Nawfal al-Hassan, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff to Iraq's Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi. Dr. al-Hassan has served at the embassy here, the Iraqi embassy here in Washington, but he was later the foreign policy advisor to Iraqi Prime Minister Nur al-Maliki before assuming his current position. He's the author of many articles focusing on the economic impacts of emerging democracies, on e-government, on the Iraq Middle East trade relationships. So anyway, we're looking very much forward to hearing what Dr. Hassan has to say and sharing as he shares his insights into the economic development of the region. Dr. Abdullah al-Dadari is the senior advisor, currently the senior advisor on reconstruction for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank, and he's a very busy man. Previously, he was Deputy Executive Secretary at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. Before joining the UN, he was Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs and Minister of Planning for the Syrian Arab Republic. Abdullah is the best person to talk about issues of economic regional cooperation from an economic standpoint. MEI's Senior Vice President for Research and Policy, Dr. Paul Salam, will be joining the discussion and sharing some of his findings in a book that he recently co-authored with another senior expert at the Middle East Institute, Dr. Ross Harrison. It's called From Chaos to Cooperation Towards Regional order in the Middle East, and that's also available here for you to purchase if you'd like to. It's published by the Middle East Institute. To moderate this very distinguished panel is MEI's Director for Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogue, Dr. Rhonda Slim. Rhonda is also a non-resident fellow at Johns Hopkins University SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. A long-term practitioner of Track 2 dialogues and peace-building processes in the Middle East and Central Asia, Rhonda is highly sought after for her comments by the press. She's well recognized as one of as an expert in conflict management, post-conflict peace-building, and Middle East politics in general. Before we begin, just let me do some housekeeping. If you've got your phones, could you please mute them? Because we do have cameras in the back. We are taping this, and we will put the video, post the video up on our website, but also there are a few other cameras as well. But don't turn your telephones off, because we encourage you to tweet. And if you do tweet, please use hashtag MEIIraq. And then just one final note, I always like to tell everybody who comes here, this is not our formal headquarters. We are renting this temporarily while we rebuild our historic headquarters right around the corner. You can walk by there and see the cranes, and you can see them pouring the cement if you'd like. It's very exciting. It completely gutted the building. We're pushing back, we're pushing up. It's 140% larger than it had been before. It will be done in a year. This costs money. And if you're a regular member or a regular participant in our events, please pick up one of the pamphlets and pledge cards on your way out. We really appreciate any support at any level that you could give to us as we move forward in this very exciting process. So let me get out of the way and turn it over to Rhonda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy, for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this panel today with three of my friends and colleagues. Our three panelists, we bring to this discussion a wealth of experience and perspectives to this important discussion of regional cooperation. I've had the pleasure of working with them over the past 5 years, and I expect a stimulating and rich discussion. The Middle East remains one of the least integrated regions in the world. There is no visible and formal security architecture akin to those in other regions. There might be some sub-regional structures arrangement like the GCC. And on the economic side, the Middle East is one of the world's least economically integrated regions. To give you an example, in terms of intra-regional trade, only 9% of the total exports of the region are part of the intra-regional trade. If you compare this with Europe, it's 70% of their exports is intra-regional. In Asia, 52% of the export is intra-regional. And as we see the influence and interest of outside actors in the region political trajectory receding, we are seeing interventions by regional actors exacerbating civil conflict rather than contributing to conflict de-escalation and conflict management. Existing institutions in the region whose mandate is to promote cooperation and conflict management, like the Arab League, like the GCC, are riven currently with internal division and strife. Given this bleak picture, it's rational for cynics to ask, why regional cooperation now? Is there a political will for it? What are the pathways to transition the region from this status quo of civil wars, domestic instability, intra-regional competition and strife to a stable and cooperative regional framework? Our working hypothesis in the Middle East dialogue, as well as in the book that Wendy mentioned by Paul and Ross, is that without de-escalating ongoing civil wars, it will be difficult to generate the political will necessary for a new regional architecture. Hence, as Wendy said, our emphasis or our agenda in the Middle East dialogue has been a two-track agenda. One hand, conflict de-escalation and conflict management, and the other is more hopeful, looking forward, imagining, thinking together, brainstorming about the principles and element of an institutional regional framework. Now, I will say a few quick words about how our discussions about regional cooperation have evolved over the past 4 years, building on what Wendy has just said in her introduction. I can say there were 3 phases in our discussions. Phase 1, mapping and analyzing the trends shaping regional political and security dynamics, including the youth bulge, sectarian identity dynamics, governance deficit, the influence of extra-regional actors on the region, and the factors contributing to the weakness of the regional institutions as vehicles for regional integration. Phase 2, discussing other institutional arrangements and processes of regional cooperation frameworks, including, among others, the OSCE, the European Union, ASEAN, African Union, and models of regional cooperation in Latin America, including the AOS. Phase 3, which resulted in this product we are sharing with you today, is engaging in a visioning and brainstorming and exercise about a future regional cooperation framework, starting with discussions about what principles should underpin this new regional cooperation framework, moving on to the types of interim confidence-building pilot initiatives to generate the political will necessary for regional cooperation. The Baghdad Declaration, which you have with you, presents both principles and pilot initiative. Using the single text negotiating technique, it's a group consensus document. And as Wendy said, this has gone through many drafts. It has evolved over a number of years. It's not the result of just a meeting or of 2. I want to point out that this initiative or this work on regional cooperation is neither the first nor the only effort discussing a new regional architecture for the Middle East. There are other groups working on the same topic. Academics, think tankers are writing papers and books about it. MEI has its own book on regional cooperation. This process is different in that this Baghdad Declaration is the result of a sustained policy dialogue involving a mix of officials, current and former, experts from across the Middle East with limited outsider involvement, thinking together about a hopeful future for the region and providing a template for a regional cooperation framework that governments can adopt once the political will is there. Based on other international experiences with regional integration projects, agreeing on principles is usually the first step in such a process. I'm going to stop here and turn over the discussion to our 3 panelists. Each will speak for about 8-10 minutes, addressing this topic at hand from his perspective and his expertise. We will follow it with a 25-minute question and answer discussion among us. And then I'm going to try to leave the last 30 minutes for a question and answer with the audience. I would like to remind you all, this is a Q&A. You ask the question, they answer. And so at this point, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Naufal, and he will start us off. By the way, I asked all of our 3 panelists to address in their remarks, to try to address, again, from their different perspective, 2 overarching questions. Why is a new regional cooperation framework needed for the Middle East? And what are the obstacles, challenges facing it? And I have to say that Prime Minister Abadi has been recently at the forefront of pushing ideas for a new regional cooperation framework. And so having Naufal in the room, I think, will, on the panel, helps us in also injecting this perspective from the region on regional cooperation. Dr. Al-Hassan.
Thank you, Randa. It's my pleasure to be here in Washington and also in the Middle East Institute. I remember a few years ago when we had a first meeting. It was in Berlin, and then many other meetings I participated with other colleagues and friends from the Middle East and elsewhere to discuss. In that time, we were mainly focusing on the crisis. It was in Iraq, during Daesh, and Syria and the region, generally speaking. But now I can clearly say, after decades of instability for the region. We are reaching to a turning point. We could say we have a successful or beginning of successful story where region and the world work together to defeat one of the worst organizations. Not only came to Iraq, although the big fight was in Iraq, and hopefully we're going to turn that chapter in Syria and in the region as well. But we tried for the last 4 decades to fight each other's, to disagree with each other's, to weakening each other's. And what's the result? You know, we lost trillions of dollars and millions of people. If I can just focus on the last 40 years, you know, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and what happened after that, then Iranian Revolution, then Iraqi-Iran war, then Saddam invasion to Kuwait, and then the sanction, and you can go on and on and on. That unstable region led to losing the resources. And even more than losing the resources, a new generations in the region lost their faith, lost their hope. And that's what fed an organization, and backward organization like Daesh, with a young people. They're supposed to be in universities or supposed to be in the workforce. They kill themselves and others in mosques, in church, in hospitals, in schools. So something wrong in the region happened for the last few decades. During our conversation, although we try to not spend more time in the moment, I remember in 2014, late 2014, you know, people look at the progress in Syria. Somebody think it's probably going to be, you know, conclude within a couple months. And people look at Iraq in different perspective. However, in that time, we try to pull ourselves from the moment and look at it from, you know, macro level. And, you know, the conclusion that we had it for all these years of dialogue and conversation, and a lot of time from parties in a personal level, doesn't represent their countries, but they represent a notion, a tone, a trend where, you know, clash is the dominated trend. So I can clearly see things, not only what happened after we liberated Mosul and liberated the rest of Iraq. I can see we couldn't do it alone. Although the big fight, you know, happened in Iraq and the big loss from Iraqis, but the help from the world, help from the region, the understanding, the security, you cannot divide it. You cannot live in a country, in a peaceful, stable country, and your neighbors is burning, or unstable neighbors. And I remember 10 years ago, probably people in Syria look at the instability in Iraq in a different perspective than they look at it right now. Same thing with the other countries in the region. So we think, and we do believe, not only the security cannot divide it, but also the economy. You know, we can go in the numbers, and I think Dr. Abdullah will focus on the economic perspective. But if you look at it, most of the trade for the region, it's not internal trade. It's with somewhere else. And while we can do even more by cooperating, by building bridges than fighting each other or weakening each other's. We have a lot of mutual threats. I'm not talking about just political or security. Even if we look at the environmental challenges. You know, the region changed for the last couple of decades. And in a city like Kirkuk or even north of Iraq, we start seeing you know, a red sky by, you know, sandstorms, unusual sandstorms in the north of Iraq. Usually just the western side of Iraq, where the city is closer to the desert, and they have it rarely, every few years. Right now, we have it frequently in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, even in Turkey. So that environmental challenges, we have a problem with dry-out, with the water problem and water distribution resource. And we can go on and on and on with the mutual problems that we can stand together to address it in a better way than we can do it, and sometimes we cannot do it alone. So it's you know, our desire and our aim to have a new framework that will bring the region to work together. It's not a preferable, it's must, the way how we see it. If we look at how we will do it, I think what we call it Baghdad Declaration, you know, that efforts that we spend years to put it together and agree on it. It's include, I think, 12 items. It's a very nice framework. Dr. Haidar al-Ibadi, the Prime Minister of Iraq, you know, presented initiative on October 21st. It's a kind of similar to where we are heading in this declaration. It's include 5 important key angles to look at the problem and turn it to opportunity for the region. You know, starting from, you know, learning from our experience from these decades of conflicts and problems and wars and tension. And we look at it, learning from that, and turn it to a way of working together. It's also, we understand, you know, the governments could come together regardless of how, you know, large differences between government A and government B, but it's not sustainable compared to the region and public and people relationship. So we are for increasing the relationship between the people in this region. I can give you an example. You know, for decades, you know, there was a problem between Iraq and Iran, and there was a war. There was big differences after 2003 when religious pilgrims come back and forth. People start, you know, thinking the relationship in a different perspective. Iraqi and Saudi's relationship, and again, we cannot hide it. There was a lot of, you know, perception in both communities, both societies, and unfortunately, most of it negative. You know, perceptions. Recently, when we both countries open themselves to each other's, it's not only visits and between officials, but now we start receiving people from Saudi Arabia coming to Iraq, and, you know, they was, you know, shocked when they see the realities. Just last week when we had that soccer match between you know, national teams, Iraqi and Saudis in Basra, and people embracing not only Iraqi team but also Saudis. Again, that comes up. So the phone call between the you know, King Salman and Prime Minister Abadi a couple days ago, they were talking about the, you know, soccer match. See things going from, you know, not only from top to down, but from the bottom, from the grassroots. And I can go on and on when we talk about the economic relationship with Turkey, or economic relationship with Jordan, and economic relationship and cultural relationship, traditional cultural relationship in the region. If we look at what happened, again, learn from the lesson of Daesh, or even Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that the region suffered, and specifically Iraq. We know how many young people we lost in this, I call it phenomena. It's not just only fights. They left their universities or their schools and joined that terrorist organization and killing innocent people. Governments in the regions need to bring back hope to the young populations. In a country like in Iraq, and I think it's not too far from other countries in the region, we have a 61% of the population born after 1991. And we have a 40% of the population born after 2002. So we have a lot of young people. Every single year, there's millions of young boys and girls entering the job market with less hope. And when they see their elites, their governments fighting each other, just tension and problems, they lose the hope. And obviously, where's the exit strategy for them? The terrorist group will easily attract them. If you compare how much time needed for Al-Qaeda to recruit young men, compare it with how much time needed for Daesh. Usually, Al-Qaeda spend years to convert people, to educate them, to make them practice religion in their way. Daesh could do that in a couple months, and sometimes weeks. So part of the Prime Minister Abadi initiative, and which is in line with our declaration, is providing hope for the young people and focus more on economic prosperity, on economic development. And that economic development, we don't need to have it for a specific region or specific country or even specific society or specific sector or ethnic group. Sometimes we suffer in the region where you have a very nice cities, well-developed cities, and you go just a couple hundred kilometers north or south, and you see very poor neighbors. So it's not well distributed. So the development need to be sustainable and need to be well, based on the citizenship, based on equality. And last thing, I know probably, the last pillar from the initiative, the region used to play a key role in the world. A lot of invasion in the world, a lot of great things in the world, in science, technology, literature, came from the region. Right now, we are exporting terrorists. So when the region sit together, increase the level of dialogue and cooperation based on respect each other's, will provide the opportunity that the region could play a positive role in the world, solving the problems for the world and for the region. And again, respecting the minorities, respecting the human rights, and building states rather than building frames that approved failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Hassan. Dr. Al-Dardari, economically, why does it make sense, and why are we losing by not having regional integration and cooperation?
Thank you, Randa. Thank you, everyone. I rarely disagree with Randa on anything, and I don't dare to. Out of love and affection, of course. But I have this time to add to what you said,
okay.
So not to disagree, but to add to what you said about the very low level of economic integration in the region. Official and formal trade statistics in the region show us the 9% of inter-Arab trade compared as part of the total Arab trade. However, if I may say, if we take oil out of the total trade in the Arab region, inter-Arab trade is almost 45% out of total Arab trade. It's not a very good sign, by the way, because it means we are not competitive in international markets, but we are competitive in each other's markets. And it's a normal thing because any gravity model in trade analysis shows you that language is the strongest variable in determining the level and the strength and the flow of trade across the region or across the world. If we take informal statistics, you will see that that number goes up to even 60%. Informal trade between Iraq and Syria in 2010 was almost $5 billion a year. There is no official statistics that shows such numbers. And that's because of our customs services are corrupt, they are inefficient, they don't capture the right numbers. Our tariffs structures were not inducing to transparency and for divulging numbers. I think the inter-Arab trade question deserves a much deeper look than what we know today. I'm trying to say that the region is much more integrated than we think it is, and therefore integration is the only way forward. I'll put that in my argument. The second aspect is that if we go beyond trade, let's take the question of remittances. This region has the highest level of intra-regional remittances anywhere in the world. But that is integration. Labor mobility, people sending money back home from the countries where they live and work in the region, that's a very high level of integration. And I can tell you that in the past 7 years, what kept a large part of the Syrian society alive are the remittances, mainly from the 2 million Syrians in Saudi Arabia and 500,000 in UAE. And when I was recently in Baghdad with His Excellency, I was so heartened to see hundreds of young Syrian men and women working in tourism and restaurants and sending back money to back home and sustaining their families back home. And if we look at foreign direct investments, not the formal numbers, but the informal numbers, you will see that the percentage of FDI, intra-regional and FDI, is very high. But since we don't have developed banking system, and we don't have very good taxation systems, and since we don't have a good protection for foreign investments, what happens is that a Qatari person would hand over $2 million cash to a Syrian friend or to an Iraqi friend, say, please start a project for me in your country. That's most of the FDI in the region, by the way. And therefore, we are much more integrated, even economically, than what appears in formal statistics. And in fact, let's face it, there is no other explanation how these conflicts in the region have spread so easily from one country to another without that level of integration. And it's, if you look at the impact, for example, of the Syria conflict on the growth levels in Lebanon, you see a drop of almost 4.5 percentage points of GDP growth. That is a reflection of a very, very high integration between the two economies. No, if there is a big conflict in Ukraine, and there was a conflict on Ukraine, its impact on East European and Central European economies were much less than the impact of the Syrian conflict on Lebanon and Jordan. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a very high level of integration, not well structured, does not produce the decent jobs that our young men and women need, and is not reflected in political and security aspects. Sorry. Another point I want to say about regional integration, I have 2 more points to go quickly, is that the model of a country-based economic growth and development has reached its maximum output. There is no future, even without the conflicts in the region, there is no future for that model which is self-sustained economic development short of without regional integration. Let's take the largest economy in the region, Saudi Arabia. The economies of scale of Saudi Arabia are too small to justify the necessary investments in R&D that are the only way to change the value added and to achieve a paradigm shift in Saudi productivity and economic diversification. It's a vicious circle. And so in order to achieve economies of scale in the region, you have to go beyond your border. Markets cannot be limited to small national markets. And in fact, the experience of the great Arab free trade area of 1995 to 2005 has been very impressive. Levels of trade have increased dramatically, and we could associate and correlate clearly the improvement in GDP growth and youth employment in the region. We could correlate it to that increase in trade between those countries as a result of liberalizing trade. And I can tell you stories about all the models that we've developed previously and now at the bank on what are the potential that exist if we reduce the non-tariff barriers, if we expand the free trade to other sectors, if we eliminate the exemptions. Therefore, there is no future for the economy of the region, each country by itself. Our labor markets are too narrow. Our productive bases are too narrow. Our consumption markets are too narrow, each one country operating on its own. And now, let's add to it very clearly, security cannot be managed on our own. Our opponents don't recognize national borders. I don't know why and how we can deal with them with sticking to the narrow definition of national borders and not moving towards cross-border operations for the economy and for security cooperation. My last point on economic integration is that with this tremendous damage that happened in the region due to the events of the past 7 years, you can call it whatever you want to call it, a revolution, an Arab Spring, uprisings, conflicts, I leave that to each one of us. But the reality is that the region has lost assets of almost $1 trillion. And it will require hundreds of billions of dollars of investments to rebuild. The only way you can attract that investment is to show that the region is a big market, and to show that you can operate cross borders freely, and to show that we need to optimize the utilization of resources. I cannot imagine that we can start rebuilding all the hospitals destroyed in Syria and Iraq and wait until they are all rebuilt until we offer health services to our people. We have to find regional solutions for education and health services for our citizens. People cannot wait. I heard a statement recently from a minister of health saying, we want to build 20 hospitals to provide health services. Well, my friend, that will take 5 to 10 years from looking at past experiences. The people cannot wait 10 or 5 years for health services. They have to have services today, probably cross-border, and using digital technology and using the internet could be possible ways of a leapfrog into offering public services. The international community is encouraging regional cooperation, if only from a purely economic perspective. We in the World Bank know clearly, and we have done so much studies on the opportunity cost that we are losing as a result of lack of regional cooperation. Just a recent study showed that if only the Levant countries improve their economic cooperation, an increase of $50 billion in annual GDP of those 3, 4, 5 countries could ensue in a very, very short time. Can you imagine how much investments we would need to increase our GDPs by $50 billion in 1 year? So it's a worthy investment politically, from a security perspective, from a human development perspective. And I want to close by saying, if there was no ability of the people of the region to move from one country to another, I know how burdensome the question of refugees is. But can you imagine the ferocity of the fighting inside each country if people could not have the chance to cross the border and find lives somewhere else? This region was built on migration. It was built on its people moving from one place to another. I would like to close by saying, now that we are in the presence of a senior Iraqi government official and has been from Syria, there is no future for Aleppo without Mosul. if you don't know how close these two cities are and don't understand the bounds that bring them together and in the past and should bring them together in the future, our planning for rebuilding Mosul and our planning for rebuilding Aleppo will be incomplete, to say the least. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. Paul, what do other regions tell us about regional integration when they, they have tried it? And then what does the Baghdad Declaration say in terms of specifics?
And let me sort of start from where Abdullah ended up. I mean, emphasizing the fact that there's tremendous amount of interdependence in this region and interaction and integration, which underlines, first of all, that it is an actual region. A region is not a description of a geographic area. It's a set of societies that are actually interacting with each other in many different ways. And when we see all of the current interactions and some of the positives that Abdullah was talking about, at the same time, as he indicated, the tremendous amount of destruction and loss that has happened in this region, a lot of that is due to the absence of a regional order or regional rules of the game that would not only protect against conflict and proxy conflicts and wasting of resources, but would actually go beyond that to build on common interests and common plans and then build common markets and all the rest. So when I look at the region, I mean, we often look and focus on failed states. I look at the region and I see a failed region, that this is a region that has collapsed. And the cost of that regional collapse you can see within a state or even within a sub-region of a state like Aleppo or Mosul or otherwise. But really, it's a collapse of a region or the failure of a region. And when we talk often about transition, we're talking about transition in Tunisia and the Arab Spring and so on, I look at the region and I see a need for regional transition from a conflict system that particularly as relates to the currently most active regional proxy or regional conflict zone, which is between sort of Iran on the one hand and a number of neighbors at the other. That conflict system has been around since 1979. And unless the region transitions from a system of conflict to a system of cooperation and so on, there's very little that can be done to produce stability elsewhere. And while we often talk of state building and the institutions that are necessary there, and they're very important, we need to focus on region building and which institutions, which agreements, which patterns can create a region that is stable and that is prosperous as well. When you look historically at other regions, you look at Europe. Europe was much more divided, much more violent, much more loss of life, much more extremism 70, 80 years ago than the Middle East today. And yet, the countries of Europe, the societies of Europe, came up with an alternative vision for Europe, and there were leaders to bring that about, that the Europe, which was the locus of regional conflict and exported its conflicts all over the world and led to the death of millions and genocides and all kinds of horrors, was able to move from a conflict system to a cooperation system. If you look at the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of the Civil War or the international armed interventions or the major revolutions were happening in East Asia. Wars in Vietnam and Cambodia, revolution in China, regional instability, US presence, Russians, and so on. And yet, East Asia has managed to transition from a conflict system, which took lives of millions, to a regional cooperation framework, largely under ASEAN, and done over a very long period of time that included a vision and leaders that could bring it about. When we talk, and there's a lot of talk today about Vision 2030. Obviously, Saudi Arabia has a Vision 2030. I know Dr. Naufal, Iraq has a Vision 2030, and those are very important. To imagine that any of these plans have any chance of success without a regional Vision 2030 is nonsense. There's no way that could, in fact, happen. So other regions have gone through these processes. Every region is different. Europe had its own path, East Asia and others. But certainly it gives hope that such things can happen. When we look at our own region in the Middle East, in the 1950s and 1960s, yes, there was a conflict system. It was between revolutionary Egypt and Saudi Arabia. There was wars in Yemen and revolutions in Iraq and proxy armies and US interventions and all the rest of it. And very few at the time could imagine that that would soon fade and we'd be in a cooperative situation, at least between those players. For many decades, the Israeli-Arab conflict was the main one that dominated everybody's consciousness and led to many coups and certainly many armed non-state actors. Some were called terrorist groups, a lot of international interventions as well. That has not been resolved, but it has certainly ebbed in consciousness, and now we are in a different reality. So when people today seem to be obsessed with the sort of Arab-Iranian, or whether it's called it Sunni Shia or whatever, and there's a lot of issues there to be addressed, in the historical viewpoint, these things can also be overcome. On moving towards sort of a transition of this kind, a number of things are key. One is a vision, that you have to imagine a different future. And this is what we're trying to do in this initiative. This is not a work plan, per se. It's not a political agreement. But it's a vision of a different region based on different principles and respect for those different principles. And vision is extremely key, because without it, you don't know where you want to go. You don't know what the destination is. In Europe, you had visionaries like Jean Monnet or Robert Schuman, who laid the ideas out in a Europe that was tearing itself apart. Vision alone, however, is not enough to bring these things about. It takes bold leadership. In Europe, you had figures like Konrad Adenauer, even Winston Churchill after the war, who called for a United States of Europe. Political figures who, A, realized that they cannot, as both Naufal and Abdullah said, you cannot achieve national objectives in a region that is in flames, and that realize that as national leaders, they have to call for regional transformation. And that kind of diplomacy is a sign of strength, to my mind. It's a sign of boldness rather than a sign of weakness. I think sometimes of Anwar Sadat, who was stuck in a conflict trap between Egypt and Israel, and used a combination of, yes, power and military things as well, but a bold diplomatic initiative that created a reality that before his bold initiative could hardly be imagined. Could hardly be imagined that such a thing would take place. Or you think of Kissinger, Nixon, and China, the idea that that conflict system could be transformed. So I do think that in addition to the vision, there is a role for bold leadership to try to create new realities in the conflict system that we're trapped in. In ending, I just want to sort of go through the 12 principles that were laid out in the Baghdad Declaration. You have a copy of it, I think, within your papers. And as was mentioned, this took place over many, many years with participants from Iran and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Emirates and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Egypt, Arab League, UN, and others. These principles are not invented out of thin air. They are basically the principles of interstate relations that are the bedrock of all regional cooperation systems. They start with a respect for national security, national state security, and respect for the sovereignty of states. And it's worth mentioning that every state in the Middle East today thinks it's under attack and thinks it's under threat and thinks that its national security is threatened. And every state thinks that the other state is aggressing it and is compromising its national security. So reassurances about that are absolutely key. Second, a commitment to peaceful and diplomatic resolution of disputes. Disputes are normal. Conflict is normal over economic, political, or even security issues. That is the nature of interstate international relations, but a commitment to peaceful resolution is a major cornerstone. Third, a commitment among states to help each other, in a sense, promote good governance and to encourage a respect for international humanitarian law. Now, that's obviously challenging in countries that are going through civil wars or uprisings where there isn't really a nation-state system to hold accountable. Fourth, a commitment, at least among all the participants that were in our dialogue, to confront and defeat terrorist organizations. Fifth, a commitment to respect strengthening of state security institutions and working to achieve a state monopoly over the use of force. In other words, a commitment that it's the state monopoly that has to eventually supplant any armed non-state actors that are present in many of these countries. Sixth, a respect for ethnic, religious, and sectarian and cultural diversity. That this is obviously a region that is very, very diverse. That's part of its richness. 7, commitment to return of refugees. 8, a commitment and an acknowledgement of the principle of security through cooperation. That, as I think Naufal mentioned, you cannot have a secure state in an insecure region. 9th, a commitment to regional economic integration, building on the good patterns, some of which already exist, in terms of labor, investment, as well as water and energy, and eventually climate change as well, already having its impacts, to build on that. 10th, a commitment to cultural interaction and exchange so that the peoples of the region build relationships people to people. The 11th principle mentions a few confidence-building measures and pilot initiatives that could be the building blocks and the beginnings. We're aware, perhaps today, that maybe the governments of some of the countries in the region are not ready to sit down with each other and talk about everything, but there could be pilot projects in 3 realms. One, the realm of security, could start with easy things like maritime security or fighting smuggling or fighting some terrorist movements from place to place. There are certainly areas and pilot projects in security that could be initiated among some of the states of the region. Second realm of confidence building measures and pilot initiatives are in economic cooperation and integration. As Abdullah said, a lot of that is already in play. There are certainly not only among governments, but among business organizations and various sectors, ways that that could be greatly enhanced. And the third area of confidence building and pilot initiatives, certainly at the cultural and educational level, since this is an area of common, there's languages that are shared in big swaths of it, but certainly a cultural and religious heritage that is very diverse and rich, but in essence shared. The 12th principle is a commitment, sort of a future commitment towards, in a word, moving towards an architecture, a permanent architecture, which would include, at least at this stage, the Arab countries, Turkey and Iran in a permanent structure. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Renda.
Thank you, Paul. You know what? I think we will now turn to questions with the audience. But before I do that, I would like to point to Professor Dan Sower. He's a member of this project team and has played an indispensable role in the development and drafting and negotiations of this document. And so I would like to point that out. Ambassador Yassin, تفضل.
A brief comment and then 2 questions. So my first comment is the following. Some 10 years ago, I was involved in a national reconciliation project in Iraq that eventually took place in Helsinki, and that was led to the Helsinki Agreement. So I'm really gratified that now people go to Baghdad for a Baghdad Declaration. It's actually a great source of pride for me. So thank you for having made that happen. I have 2 questions. And it was pointed out that the level of integration in the Arab region, Middle East region, is way beneath what it is elsewhere. But it wasn't this way. I mean, in many ways, when I'm listening to you, I think I'm listening to a plea for empire. So my question to you, and I'm sure there are economic historians amongst you, how well integrated were we before the Europeans came to the Middle East? And I raise this issue because in my collective memory, in the collective memory of my family, the relationships that you pointed out between Aleppo and Mosul are very aligned. Okay, now my first question. My second question has more of a utilitarian aspect to it. Okay, many of the Arab countries in the Middle East have huge diasporas. In this country, for example, these diasporas integrate for that matter, intermarry very often. How can we try to operationalize this? And I've asked you this question before, how can we operationalize this? I'm asking as an ambassador of one of these countries in this country to try to help and promote integration of the Middle East.
Thank you. Would you like to take the first question?
And should we take a few questions?
I mean,
or
let's
one by
start.
one?
Let's start with. Okay, let's take a few questions. Yes. Would you remember? I mean, yes.
We'll write
Go
them
ahead.
down.
Yeah, please write it down. Write down the questions.
Thank you for hosting this interesting conference.
Please, your name and
My name is Deyar Wejde. I'm the Executive Director for Center of Rule of Law and Good Governance in Washington, D.C. Quick two questions. First, for
to the panel and to some people.
First one to Paul Salem, Mr. Paul Salem. I went through the declaration. There is no explicit mention of accountability. And you mentioned Europe. Europe, after like the Second War, there was a Nuremberg trial, and that was crucial actually to settle Europe and to go forward for new countries. I mean, here in the region, after this conflict and the uprisings in several areas, we have not seen actually a clear, like a good accountability and no mention for accountability mechanism. So I just want to highlight this. Second, for Mr. Dardari, quickly. And you mentioned like economic integration. In 2003, you were the head of the planning commission in Syria. I'm a Syrian. Do you think that the economic deal between Syria and Turkey in any way was counterproductive and contributed to the conflict? Third, for you, sorry, this is very quick, Mr. Al-Hassan, you mentioned the Middle East like exporting terrorism, and you kept mentioning Al-Qaeda. Probably you mentioned Al-Qaeda like 6 times and ISIS. You never mentioned like a practice by the Popular Mobilization Force in Iraq, by Hezbollah coming to kill people for sectarian reason in Syria. I would also be cautious to speak about ISIS as a Middle Eastern product, as the statistic says 40% of their fighters come from Europe. And this just, and I have a question here. You mentioned ISIS and terrorism, but you did not explain what was the root of ISIS emergence in the region.
All right, that's a fair question. Okay, one more. We already have like, what, 6 questions? Yes, the lady. Please, here. Yes, thank you.
Zainab Suwaid from the American Islamic Congress. Dr. Naufal, thank you very much for your information that you have provided us today. How do you see the future collaboration proceeding in the region, especially in Iraq, under the 2 neighboring powerful countries? How do you see the balance has been drawn between the power of Iran and the Saudi Arabia on the other hand? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give the panelists the opportunity to answer these questions, and then we do another round of questions. Dr. Naufal, would you like to start with the last question?
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Zainab. It's I'm going to envision, definitely I don't have a crystal ball, so don't quote me of what I see, but probably 10 years from now, I can see there is a direct trade from Saudi Arabia and Iran through Iraq. Okay, you probably know we just start opening the border with Saudi Arabia. So there is going to be a potential trade between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And when we talk about the pilgrims, people going to Hajj from Iraq, I mean, it's a But also there's a people coming from Saudi Arabia to Iraq for the religious shrines and others. At this moment, I know there's a lot of differences and a lot of tension. But again, if we pull ourselves from the moment and just go look at it from a macro level, there are a lot of common threats and a lot of common opportunities. When we talk about strategic industries that the region wants, they want not only the raw materials, but also they want the market. So again, I don't want to talk about the details briefly. New generations in both countries, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, all the Gulf area, even Egypt, I can see them getting closer to each other's, not only using the social media, but they know each other more than 10 or 20 or 15 years ago. When they know each other, they can probably understand the differences. It's not going to happen soon, but I see both countries coming closer, and Iraq could play a very positive role in this. To the question for the gentleman from Syria, I feel your pain. Again, I was a refugee. I left Iraq when almost all the world abandoned Iraq in 1990. Okay, so I know what the refugee camps mean. I know what's the people struggling for their life. I know what's the mass graves. So we lost thousands of people, in a matter of few days. When we talked to people in 1990s, nobody believed us. But after almost like 10, 15 years, when the Saddam regime fall apart, and then the videotapes and documents, people start seeing these mass graves, where we have our family members and colleagues and friends, we lost them. So I feel your pain, not only in Syria, but everywhere else. Now, the reason why I mention Daesh more than Al-Qaeda, and the reason why I mention Al-Qaeda and Daesh, it's a regional product. It's not only the final products of Daesh, the one who suicide himself or herself. I'm talking about the ideology. I'm talking about when we were in an illusion, and specifically, I don't want to mention specific regime or a country, but 10 years ago, when Baghdad was burning, some other neighbors feel safe in that time. Unfortunately, in that time, they let terrorists come through their borders and make the life in Baghdad miserable. However, the other part of your question, I'm not going to let it go. So I'm going to address it. And again, I'm more optimistic now than ever that all the governments in the region, with the different levels, but all of them, they understand how important to cooperate and how dangerous to let somebody like Daesh or Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups, manipulating your neighbors, damaging your neighbors, and you feel you're safe. One of the items in that Baghdad Declaration, it addressed this, which is having the monopoly for the arms by the governments, by the states, and specifically. But until we, as a region, reach that level, there are too many issues. And if the government doesn't address it, people, they will address it by their own, in a wrong way or in a right way. And that will make, that declaration necessary. That desire for cooperate and understanding what's your threats, what make you worry. If I understand it, probably we can get closer to each other. Last thing I would like to address the Ambassador Fareed question. you know, again, I was in a diaspora. I was, you know, one of the people who live in this city and other cities in the United States. And I know Iraq, for example, we lost, you know, cream of Iraqis, you know, in different waves. You know, 1958, when the coup, somebody call it revolution, we lost, you know, a lot of elites. And then end of 60s, we lost another wave, end of 70s, and during Iran-Iraq wars, and the big wave after the, you know, the uprising in 1991 and most of 1990s. Then there is another wave in 2003 and after 2003. So we lost a lot of professors, you know, engineers, doctors, businessmen and women. Many of them, you know, although most of them struggle in their transitioning period and time going outside of Iraq, but many of them, they had a very successful stories, you know, here in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, and many other, even in the region, you know. We can probably read and hear a lot of successful stories in the United Arab Emirates, in Jordan, by, you know, Iraqis who left their country. What's, again, you know, unless we make our countries, you know, not only safe for them back, but also attractive for them and for their generations, you know, their kids, it's going to be very difficult. But they can help a lot. Even if they decide not to come back, they can help. And we receive in Iraq, you know, a lot of physicians and doctors. They help in volunteers, even during the war. You know, a lot of doctors, you know, women doctors came to Mosul and help our troops. But it's going to be, I can look at it in a region perspective. It's going to be very important for the region to regain those millions of people who left their countries.
Tallah.
There is no rebuilding of the region without the expats. Those people living in the diaspora have to come back. From just simple numbers, again, in my country, there was 37,000 doctors before the conflict, 21,000 left. There's not going to be a health service in the country without those people returning. You cannot train 21,000 doctors in 1 year. It has taken since independence to build that number of doctors, 50,000 nurses. The country had 900 people with PhDs in chemistry. The 900 people are now in Germany. And you will need PhDs in chemistry if you want to reconstruct a destroyed economy. So we need to import a middle class, because that's what will sustain the political transformation. That's what will sustain a new social contract in those societies. And we need to import that skilled plus the capital. How do we do this? It's very difficult. There are people who established abroad, and they are not going to leave what they had built in Germany or in Saudi and come back. How do you create such opportunities for them? This is going to be a tremendous challenge. But there is no rebuilding without them. On Syria and Turkey, quickly, this is something we can discuss outside. The country at that time had decided to join the WTO and was negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU. It only made sense that the biggest country between you and Europe you should have free trade with. Yeah. It only made sense that the country where most of your water comes from has free trade access to you. A country that is booming at that time with 70 million consumers of a GDP per capita of almost $10,000 is an excellent market. Let me tell you that during this time, from 2003 to 2011, to correlate with the growth in Syrian and Turkish trade, 100,000 new industries were set up in Syria. 100,000 new industries. Unfortunately, 90,000 were destroyed in the past 7 years. For the first time in Syrian modern history, people working in industry, manufacturing, exceeded the number of people working in agriculture or in services. That industrialization of the Syrian economy that was happening only happened because of those strong signals on the willingness to open the country to free trade. Without it, No one was going to invest in the country. So, and today, whether we like it or not, whatever our political position is regarding this neighbor or that neighbor, Aleppo lost its power plant, a 1,000 megawatt power plant. To rebuild a new one, to revive Aleppo economy, we need 6 to 7 years. You can hook up to the Turkish electricity network very cheaply and very quickly. So that the prospects of regional integration have opened for us, opened our eyes to things we never thought of when we decided to do free trade with our neighbors. The potential is incredible. The question is, sorry. The question is, how do we do this? And let me tell you that there were 100,000 firms established. Only 55 companies declared bankruptcy during the same period. Wow. So when people say Turkish imports destroyed Syrian industry, that doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, how come that by 2010, for the first time in our modern history, manufacturing products were 70% of our exports? They replaced completely the drop in oil exports that happened during the same time. So there was no destruction of Syrian industry during this time. There was a massive growth of Syrian industry and productivity at the same time. I would do it again. I will not be there, but if I would.
Thank you, Abdullah. Paul.
Yeah, I just want to comment, I mean, on the regional economic integration. I think, as indicated by Abdullah in his previous comments, that when you think, whether it's looking 2030 or really thinking of a future, if any country wants to integrate into the global economy, it has to be part of an integrated regional economy. It's the same institutions, principles, market systems, same type of openness that would bring you success in global integration as would give you in regional integration. And in terms of the world community investing, as you indicated, in your country, if you're not part of a broader region, neither as investments, nor infrastructure projects, nor market, is it attractive in the same way as if you had an effective regional system that you were building. And in terms of how the global players interact with these challenges, I point to China today as the sort of the main global player, which is pushing global economic integration through its sort of one belt, one road policy, investments in infrastructure and all the infrastructures, both physical and virtual, that would help China certainly export and import and so on, but also build the same infrastructure in our region and other regions, which would allow the region to build as well. The US in the 50s and 60s used to invest in infrastructure and things of that nature. It no longer does so. Russia obviously is not interested. Europe is strapped for cash and worried about refugees. So I think there's an interesting potential role for China in that sort of regional infrastructure account. When we look at Europe, and there was an interesting question about how Europe, in terms of accountability and so on. As I said, every region obviously is profoundly different. The conflict in Europe obviously ended with winners and losers in terms of state. It was decided in a war. Our region, with the exception of an agreement to have a war on ISIS and maybe Al-Qaeda at some point, our region is not in a declared war, and I hope it won't be in a declared war, and its proxy wars are not going to be resolved by winners and losers. So we are in a different situation. I will also indicate that this document is the result of long and difficult
word by word
talks between people from Tehran and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and with very different views. So this is not, in a sense, a very advanced document. This is a subset, minimal set of principles that we managed to get agreement on. And they do cover, for example, the issues of, let's say, when you mentioned some of the armed non-state actors, we address them, as Dr. Naufal said, that the state must gradually or quickly or somehow re-establish its monopoly. Now, in Lebanon, the challenge is different than Iraq, different than tomorrow's Syria, and so on. So it's a minimal document in a region which is in flames. So getting this minimum is better than nothing.
All right, a second round of questions. I'll take three. I think the lady there in the back, and then the gentleman here, and the gentleman here. Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Basma Alouche. I'm with the Norwegian Refugee Council. And just on the topic of integration, I just wanted to maybe highlight a topic that wasn't really discussed today, or try to squeeze it in just in light of my work. And I mean, it's very clear that today we can't really talk about the recent conflicts in the region without discussing the massive influx of refugees.
It's in fact principle number 7.
Yeah, I'm getting there, just one second. And just by definition, refugees are people that have been displaced and have crossed state borders. However, a lot of the discussion, majority of these populations that have been displaced as a direct result of these conflicts tend to remain within state borders and are considered internally displaced persons. And they are one of the most vulnerable populations and don't receive a lot of attention. And just for Iraq specifically, I promise I'll go really quickly, but there's about 3.3 million people that have returned to their homes after seeking shelter in internal camps, but many are now secondarily displaced. And there's about 2.5 million people that are remaining in camps waiting for solutions to their displacement, and about 38% of them don't even want to go back to their areas of origin. And my question is, how can there be sustainable integration and returns in Iraq and the region when it seems like there are no clear plans for national governments to integrate these populations or ensure voluntary, safe, and dignified returns?
And this is to Dr. Al-Hassan?
Yes.
All right. The second question is here, please. Yes, please.
Thank you. Julian Piquet, I'll monitor. So I was hoping you could address the elephant that's not in the room, as it were. So the US and the EU, as you know, are both blocking the World Bank, the IMF, multilateral institutions from getting involved in Syrian reconstruction. I was hoping you could address, all three of you really, the negative impacts of that. If major international financial institutions stay uninvolved, what's the impact on Aleppo, on Syria, on the neighbors such as Iraq, and on the broader region? Thank you.
Thank you. And the gentleman here, please.
Honar Isa from the American University of Kurdistan. Actually, it's a positive move that Iraq could gather all of those regional power for the Baghdad Declaration. I wonder what the next step would be, and if it is going to be the implementation, how realistic it should be based on the fact that, as you can see, the region is experiencing a lot of instability, and even inside Iraq, we have a lot of militias that are actually controlling rather than the security of the state security that it should enforce. And it's not only Iraq, you can see other countries, they face the same issues. And another factor that I think no one has mentioned about the segregation among the citizens of those countries, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. So I want to just focus on that to see how realistic it would be, the implementation.
Thank you. Dr. Naufal, if you can address Basma's question and other questions.
Well, the question for IDPs, it's not less than a lot of people tend to focus on refugees more than the IDPs. I agree with you, Basma. However, in Iraq, although, relatively speaking, we didn't receive big number of Syrian refugees compared to the other neighbors like Jordan and Lebanon. But we suffered from the internal displacement. We have people from Tel Afar, from Mosul, had to go far south of Iraq, and Najaf and Karbala, and even Basra, and vice versa. And again, we had, during the sectarian tension more than 10 years ago, actually, like 12 years ago, 13 years ago, we have people, thousands of people had to leave Baghdad and go somewhere else, either north or south. when Ramadi and Anbar fall, you know, people also went to different provinces. If we address this, it requires, you know, thinking out of the box. And again, I with full appreciation to the international efforts, you know, UNDP, UN generally speaking, you know, EU, others, you know, a lot of international efforts try to help Iraq in this, to address this. And I'm talking about the, you know, hundreds, thousands of people, millions of people who had to leave their houses. You know, I'm glad most of them safely and freely went back home. But definitely some of the people, they established different life. So in principle, we cannot force them back. Now, the integration, it's again, relatively speaking, it's not copy-paste. But just like the people who left their country and come from Middle East and come to US or to Europe, some of them, they establish their life, and it's very tough. If you convince the father or mother or whatever, probably it's very tough to convince the new generations to go back. But I will briefly mention the social reconciliation. There are a lot of efforts from Iraqi government and from the civil society to focus on the not only political reconciliation, but social reconciliation. Sometimes we have a specific tribe or a specific village where you don't have a sectarian differences or ethnic differences. It's almost same religion, same sector, same ethnicity, same tribe. But some of them join Daesh, and some of them, you know, just stay away with it. So the tradition of revenge, it makes it probably very tough for those who help to burn houses and kill civilians to come back to their home. So the families of Daesh, for example. It's a very sophisticated, and again, we can go on and on for days and months addressing, you know, what's the impact of that moving society or big part of society from a place to another place. In Iraq, we look at it in a different angles. And again, we are not addressing this just only from the governments, although we do a lot of, you know, effort in that, but also the society itself try to address this. The short answer, this is not going to be solved by magic buttons. It's going to take years, if not take generations, and hopefully in a positive way. While we clearly see the sectarian and ethnic tension, it's, you know, in a subside. The other question about the role of the World Bank and IMF.
Vis-a-vis construction in Syria.
Oh, okay. So I'll leave it for Abdullah.
Abdullah, it might be a sensitive topic for you, being a World Bank executive.
No, I think we really have to look at the region, since we are on regional integration. The World Bank is very active in Iraq. We just saw the World Bank supporting the government of Iraq and other partners in convening the Kuwait Conference on Reconstruction, which was a resounding success. It takes us another step forward. The World Bank is very active in Yemen, despite those very difficult circumstances. We have a program of $1 billion already active in Yemen, and we developed a blueprint for the recovery and reconstruction of Yemen, and we are working closely with all the partners, development partners, on the financing mechanisms and the way forward and the detail of implementing the Yemen recovery and reconstruction, even though things look very grim at the time, but we are not sitting, waiting, doing nothing. In Libya, by the way, we are moving very fast. We have a three-pronged strategy for Libya to support the revival of national economic institutions, the provision of services, and the support to local council authorities. And also development of a longer-term vision for Libya. As for Syria, you know that we have done a very important analytical work, which is called the Toll of War report, which highlights the priorities and the areas that should be focused on. And the report has a very simple message. The biggest damage in Syria is to the economic organization and the social capital of the country, not just the physical aspects. And therefore, when we want to design one day a support program for the reconstruction of Syria, it will have to take into consideration the rebuilding of that social capital, the ability of Syrians to work cross lines and cross borders, the ability of them to rebuild their national institutions and social capital. That is the main conclusion. And therefore, the technical work to prepare for that moment is active, very substantive, very high quality, but at the same time, the idea of when does our authorizing environment give us the green light to go to the next level, it's part of the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of the region. And this is, we have to live with that. We are not, we don't determine the political outlook of the region. We react to it and we try to influence it by proposing constructive ideas on reconstruction. And as you may know, that we are launching a large initiative called the Building for Peace, Reconstruction for Security, Growth and Equity in MENA. And this is actually to develop a new approach for reconstruction that focuses on building new social contracts rather than rebuilding destroyed physical assets.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I just want to mention that I'm very happy that the Middle East Institute will be partly partnering with the World Bank to do some of this research on the challenges of reconstruction and the political economy of reconstruction. We're very excited and eager about that. On the question of next steps, I want to refer that to the leader of this initiative and my colleague, Dr. Randa.
Thank you. Short-term next steps, we are going to do similar panels like this in regional capitals. You know, we are hoping to do one in Dubai, in Cairo, in Ankara, and in Tehran. And there will be participants in these panels from the countries, who are part of the dialogue, participating in these panels. So we would like to put these ideas out in the public arena as much as possible, and hopefully get also more media coverage in these capitals about these ideas. So the idea of spreading and putting these ideas out in the public space. In terms of process of this group, I think, again, the declaration identifies a number of pilot initiatives, confidence building measures, and we hope to move into small task forces, putting small task forces to start thinking about, operationalization of these ideas on confidence building measures and pilot initiatives.
Randa,
this is the short to medium plan.
Randa, may
yes,
I just,
please.
there was a point about distinguishing between citizens in the region. I can, from our experience, all of us, I think, in the past years and now looking forward, without citizenship, equal citizenship as the only determining factor of relationship between the people within each country, there is no rebuilding and there is no peace. That's one. I'm asking here whether we can dare to think about a regional developmental citizenship, not particularly a legal citizenship, but those millions of people who crossed the borders and have been moving from one country to the other, can we think of them as part of the economic force of the region? Can we imagine and dream of a regional developmental citizenship that can empower those citizens or those people to contribute positively rather than being just a burden, to contribute to the future of every country in the region? I leave that idea, but with you, and there is no segregation. Okay. It won't work. There is segregation, but with it, there is no future.
Right, Dr. Hassan.
I just want to add something with what Dr. Abdullah said. I mean, we successfully liberated Mosul and other areas, but without regaining the heart of the people in these cities and villages, I cannot imagine the real liberation. We learn from mistakes, even when we a problem of the referendum in the north of Iraq, in Kurdistan. The Prime Minister Abadi insists on the peaceful movement of our troops and successfully re-engage Kirkuk back, or disputed area. Now we are working with the KRG government, and we are working with the, all the stakeholders to reintegrate. And again, I can see people in Mosul, both east side and west side of Mosul, could look at Baghdad. It's their Baghdad. But I'm sure if you ask them 5 years ago or 3 years ago, they probably have a different opinion. So this is a lesson that we learn it in Iraq. And I think, just like Dr. Abdullah said, all the region need to learn. By end of it, people could be patient when you have when the country struggle economically, when there's a natural disaster. People have a lot of patience, but they cannot be patient when they feel there's a discrimination, when they feel somebody with a citizen plus status and somebody else less. So it's a recipe for stability, to think from equal citizenship, with full respect the other identities, like ethnic identities, religious, sector, party, tribe, etc. So without that, I don't see future for the region.
Thank you very much. I promised you in the beginning a rich and stimulating discussion, and I think that's what exactly we got. Thank you very much, and thank the panelists for joining us.